The Home Front by Jasmine Cruz and Angelica Rodriguez. The war would not have been won without the sacrifices American women made.
Propagandas were made to influence people's opinions on any given subject. A few ways this was done were through posters, pamphlets, radio shows, and movies. During World War II, propaganda posters were the main influence that persuaded women to step up and help the men. The posters contained all different information, but they all had one purpose: to aid in winning the war. An example of a popular propaganda poster is the "We Can Do It" poster of Rosie the Riveter, which recruited many women to work in factories and the workforce.
Other propaganda posters that persuaded women to go into the workforce were for the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Services, Women's Reserve of the Coast Guards, Women Army Auxiliary Corps, and the Army Nurse Corps.
There were more than 59,000 American nurses serving in the Army Nurse Corps. These women worked closer to the battlefield to provide quicker medical care for the wounded soldiers. Their skill and dedication in the medical field led to roughly 4% of soldiers dying. Psychiatric nurses were also a high demand. They provided care for all the discharged soldiers over the course of the war. Nursing was a key element during this because the soldiers were depending on the nurses to help and assist them and save their lives.
By the end of World War II, there was also more than 80,000 female officers and many more enlisted in the Women Accepted for Volunteer Service program, which was also known as WAVES. In some places, the WAVES composed a large number of uniformed naval workforce. These women performed secretarial and clerical jobs along with being aviation mechanics, control tower operators, intelligence personnel, and many other tasks. This made up approximately 2.5% of the U.S. Navy's personnel strength.
Many programs like the WAVES were created during World War II. The Women's Reserve of the Coast Guard, also known as SPARS, was made to aid the war effort by providing for releasing officers and men for duty at sea. Over the course of the war, there were approximately 11,000 women who volunteered. Their duties were clerical in nature, but some involved rigging parachutes, driving vehicles, and working as radio operators. SPARS women were mainly replacing men and taking over areas that were previously under male-only control.
The Marine Corps Women Reserve wanted to provide women that were qualified for duty at shore establishments of the Marine Corps along with releasing the men from their duties. They were cleared to serve in capacities beyond clerical work and held positions in over 200 different jobs at every post. The Marine Corps approved assignments to all fields except infantry, artillery, army, and pilot air crews. By the end of World War II, about 85% of the Marine Corps personnel were women.
A big requirement that needed to be filled was the decrease of men in factories. There were not enough men able to work in regular factories, let alone additional ones, which meant that the weaponry needed to win the war could not have been produced if the women did not step up for those roles. Some women took jobs driving trucks, dealing with airplanes, working as laboratory technicians, radio operators, and many other roles that were meant for men to help throughout the war. The women who remained on the home front increased employment from 26% to 36%.
Before the war, women had dominated few factory jobs, such as textile mills, clothing industries, and food preparations. When the war had begun, there were many industrial facilities created to make machinery. These factories couldn't hire men because they were being recruited, so instead women began running them.
One of the largest facilities was the aerospace industry. The aerospace industry manufactured aircrafts, guided missiles, space vehicles, aircraft engines, and many more related parts. In 1943, there were more than 310,000 women working in the United States aircraft industry. About 300,000 planes were produced during the length of the war. The industry was the most open about women being hired, and these women made up more than 65% of the total workforce of aircrafts. They were designing planes, building them, and operating all the machinery in the factories. They also went from building a few aircrafts at a time to thousands on assembly lines.
Another important industrial facility was the munitions plants. In these factories, women made either weapons or ammunition. Jobs in this industry were critical. If the weapon parts and shells weren't accurately made, they would not perform like the gunners needed them to. The women worked long hours and were often away from home since the plants were located in unpopular areas. This was because they had high health risks, such as explosions and exposure to chemicals, and many women risked their lives to go produce machinery to aid in the winning of the war.
Shipyards were one of the industries that had expanded the most. For example, Henry J. Kaiser was able to build 7 shipyards throughout the West Coast and employed mostly women and minorities. They were able to produce 747 ships for the United States Navy and Merchant Marines during World War II, which was more than any other shipyard had produced. Rather than a single ship being built over a 14-month period of time, the workers were capable of building the Liberty ships in only 8 weeks. These shipyards worked around the clock, and the number of female workers in ships built increased throughout the years.
The automotive industry also seemed to expand due to World War II. A purpose for building these during this time period was to produce military vehicles, tanks, trucks, and jeeps. Motor vehicles were used for transport and supply, and about $29 billion worth of military material. 20% of the total U.S. material manufactured for the war came from the American automotive industries. By the end of World War II, women made up approximately 28% of the United Auto Workers membership of 1 million.